Nectar of the gods. Hello and welcome to another video. My name is Heather and as always I'm reading with a vengeance, and as always I hope you are as well. If you're a returning viewer, thank you so much for coming back, and if you are new to my channel, a very warm welcome to you. I hope everybody is doing very well. Today I'm going to talk to you about some of my favorite horror books. Now, what I consider horror might not be the same as what other people might consider horror. So horror to me is scary, is disturbing, is, well, yeah, those are two of the main things. Are they scary and disturbing? Now, I don't particularly care for just slasher type novels. Blood for the sake of blood and murder and mayhem for the sake of murder and mayhem. I want to be scared. I want to be terrified. I want to sleep with the light on. I want to look under the bed before I go to bed. Either scared or just deeply disturbed about things. So to me, those are what I consider to be good horror in books that I want to read if I want to be scared or disturbed. So I'm here to give you 15 recommendations, books that I have read over the years that I thought were really good, scary books. So buckle in and let's get started. So I'm looking at this list I have for you, and of course, if you've been watching my channel, you know I'm a Stephen King fan, so I definitely have some Stephen Kings on here, spoiler alert. But I'm not gonna sit here and say, just read a Stephen King and you'll be scared, because not all of Stephen King's books are scary. But I have picked the ones that scared me the most. And then it looks like I have a classic on here, and I have a collection of short stories. I think I have a pretty good mix of books on here. So yeah, let's get started. So the first one I have on this list is My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. This was so good. Was this the first one that I read by Grady Hendrix? I don't think it was. I think the first book that I read by Grady Hendrix was the book club's guide, the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, which was really good. And that's also a really good horror book, but it's not my favorite. So My Best Friend's Exorcism, I gave it 5 stars. I think I read it last year, so it ended up being on my top 21 books of 2021. This one hit me differently because, and I favored this one over Vampire Slayer because it takes place in the 80s, and I'm an 80s kid. I grew up in the 80s. I was a teenager in the 80s. And so this was very nostalgic for me, and I connected with the characters more. This follows Abby and Gretchen, and they are best friends in high school. And that's basically how I was in high school. I wasn't like in a big group of friends, or certainly wasn't popular by any stretch of the imagination. It was basically just me and one best friend. And that's kind of the way I've always been. I've had that one person, your one person that is your bestie. That's how these girls are written in this book. And anyways, Abby and Gretchen, they've been best friends since 5th grade, and they have a shared love for E.T., and they like roller skating and just all of the things that I just loved as a teenager as well. But when they get to high school, Gretchen starts to act differently. There are certain coincidences and events that happen, and they all just sort of kind of pile up, and Abby just is led to the conclusion that her very best friend, her favorite person in the whole world, is possessed by a demon. And so she goes about trying to deal with this. I sit here all smiley face because I'm all nostalgic, and all the nostalgia in this book with the 80s and all that entails, makes me so happy. But don't be fooled. This book was scary. It was scary. There were some pretty dark parts here, but it was so much fun, and I absolutely recommend it if you want to be scared. The whole demon possession thing, Grady Hendrix nailed it in this. It was creepy. The next book on this list is Bird Box by Josh Malerman. This one is a very well-known book. It was also a movie on Netflix. This is a very good example of the book was definitely better. So this follows Mallory, and she's living in a world where there's something out there and you don't know what it is. And it's very ambiguous as you're reading the story, but the effect it has on people is not ambiguous. If you come across this thing, you are driven to severe violence. Mostly you're driven to kill yourself if you make contact with this otherness, this being. So Mallory is the main character, and she is, the majority of the book kind of takes place 5 years after it's all kind of started happening. And Mallory is still trying to survive with her 2 young children. And there's just kind of a smattering of survivors, much like The Walking Dead, where there are good people who are just trying to live and let live. And then there are, of course, people who have taken this kind of apocalypse. It's brought out the worst in them. So Mallory is trying to survive with her children in this crazy world. She's trying to survive the thing. And then she's also trying to survive the people that are out there that are just horrible people. Because you don't want to make eye contact with this thing, if you want to go out in the world, you have to cover your eyes. And while that keeps you safe from the thing, it leaves you highly vulnerable. And that's really the scariness of this story. The thing that keeps you safe leaves you super vulnerable to other dangers in the world. It's your very edge of your seat. There's just this feeling of foreboding as you're reading it. So this is a fantastic monster / survival story that is just delicious. The next book on this list, you will be surprised that I have on this list, because I have mentioned it at least 2 different times on 2 different videos. And the times that I've mentioned it, I've mentioned how much I absolutely hate this book. But the reason I hate this book, it might be the reason you love it and find it incredibly disturbing. And that's kind of really why I hate it, is because of the way it made me feel. So when I came across it, I'm like, it has to go on this list because it matches the criteria of what this list is made of. And the book I'm talking about is American Psycho by Bret, Easton, Ellis. I hate this book so much, but I hate it because it's so disturbing and so skin crawly, and you will want to take a shower after you read this. But I have to say, you know, it's not poorly written, but you hate the main character, Patrick Bateman. He is this corporate guy who is super materialistic, but he hates everything that is corporate and materialistic. And, oh, by the way, he's a serial killer. There is satire in this book that I think went over my head when I initially read it. I might have enjoyed it more now. I just don't want to take the risk of reading it again because, but really, there's some scenes in here where the murder scenes that are just, if you've heard other people talk about this book and other people have said, oh my God, it's so disturbing, I hate this book, but you want to be disturbed and 'tis the season, give it a go. It's always good to be informed. You can offer your opinion. If you're looking for disturbing, this is it. This is a go-to. The next book I have on this list is The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. Also, very, very well-known, very, very well-known movie. This is one of those times where, you know, it's kind of hard to say. They did a really, really good job with the movie. But of course, the book is always more nuanced. There's a lot more detail in the book. If you loved the movie, I highly recommend reading the book. I will say, as creepy as the movie was, you know, between Buffalo Bill and Hannibal Lecter, they're even that much more creepy on the page. You know, if you like scary movies, if you like being scared, you know, everybody loves that feeling sitting in a dark theater and just watching it up on the screen, just play out in front of you. But if you really, really like being scared, it's more internalized when you're reading it on the page, right? And this is no exception. Of course, everybody knows that this is the story of Clarice Starling, she's a new FBI agent, and she is on this case of Buffalo Bill, who is a serial killer, and he's on the loose, and the only way they can really get clues on how to track this guy is to talk to another serial killer who is Hannibal Lecter. And so Clarice is sent to meet Hannibal Lecter, and find out what kind of insight that he can give her to help find Buffalo Bill. But of course, Hannibal Lecter wants something in return. And they develop kind of a relationship, and Hannibal gets details from Clarice about her own life, which is a no-no when you're going and talking to the criminally insane. It goes from there, and it is a really, really good story. But at the same time, there are a couple of scenes in here that are super, super intense. I remember having to put this book down a couple of times just because it's like you want to know what happens next, but you don't want to know what happens next. It's that kind of story. Definitely recommend for the spooky season. The next book I have on this list is from Uncle Stevie, and that is Pet Sematary, of course, by Stephen King. This book scared the crap out of me, and I read this as an adult. Oh my God. This follows the Creed family who move to an old house in rural Maine. Father is a doctor, and the wife, and then the two children. I believe there's a daughter who's older, and then there's I believe in the book it's a newborn son. Anyways, they move into this house and they meet their neighbor, Jed, who tells the father, I can't remember his name, about a pet cemetery that is out in the woods. And that there's just kind of like a children's folklore that if you bury something in this pet cemetery, mostly pets, they come back. And so the story goes from there. Now, I will say that this book is really great in that it deals with grief a lot. And I really think that's the underlying theme with this book. I think he does a really good job with it. But in true Stephen King fashion, he wraps up these really heavy themes, really important themes, wraps it up in a lovely horror tortilla. And there's some scary parts. And let me tell you something. One of the things that scares me a lot in books and movies are evil children. It scares the crap out of me. And that's all I'll say about that. The next one I have on this list is Salem's Lot by Stephen King. This is a vampire story. I won't go too far in the details because this is, a lot of people, of course, have heard about Stephen King books. I will just say it's not just a vampire book, and none of Stephen King's are just what the cover says it is. That's the genius behind Stephen King. But this one takes place in a small town. People aren't who you think they are. There's lots going on in this book. If you like vampire stories, even if you don't like vampire stories, I think this is one of the few vampire stories on this list. This is just very well written. It is kind of a brick. It's probably, how many pages is it? I think it's right around 480 pages, 500 pages or so, but it's a page turner. This one will suck you in and scare the crap out of you. While we're talking about Stephen King, let's just get him out of the way. The next one I will recommend by Stephen King is Misery. Another one where they did a really, really good job with the movie, but if you haven't read the book, oh my God, there's so much more in the book. Of course, this one follows Paul Sheldon, who is a very famous author, and he is driving through, I believe, rural Maine, and he gets into a car accident, and it's the winter, there's snow, and there's not very much traffic. He gets into a car accident, and he's stuck in the car. And a woman finds him, a local woman, happens to find him and brings him home to nurse him back to health. Turns out, not only is this woman Paul Sheldon's biggest fan, but she's cuckoo crazy. She is a little upset with Paul because in Paul's most recent novel, which happens to be a series, who the main character, I think her name is Misery, Paul kills her off, his main character off, and this is very upsetting to Annie. Annie is his biggest fan. Very upsetting to her, and she is not only helping to nurse Paul back to health, but it gets to the point where Annie says, "You're not going anywhere until you rewrite this." Man, stuff goes down. And if you know, you know, but there's a scene in here that is so hard to read. I don't know if Paul tries to escape. I can't remember. He does something else that is upsetting to Annie, and Annie teaches him a lesson. If you know, you know, OMG. But this one is a page turner. I mean, you will get through this one really quick. It's got that claustrophobic feel because you're stuck in this cabin. Paul is trapped, you know, he's being held prisoner by this crazy woman, and you feel that as you're reading it, and it's gripping. The last novel I'll talk about of Stephen King is actually the book that I found the most scary of his. Of all the Stephen King books that I've read, and I read most of them, the scariest to me was It. This one scared the crap out of me. I read this, I want to say I was in my late 20s when I read this. I read it when I was on vacation with my significant other at the time. He was sleeping in the bed next to me, and I was still scared. I was still looking under the bed. I was still just kind of, why am I reading this at night? Very, very scary. As you know, this follows a group of young kids in small town Maine, and bad stuff is happening, and there's Pennywise the clown who lives under the drain, and it's... The great thing about this book, though, is if you like following a group of friends that are tweens or preteens and the shenanigans they get into in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, they're in the 80s. And so it's kind of a coming of age, but a rather terrifying, nightmarish coming of age. Bad stuff happens to all of them, and then they grow up and bad stuff starts happening again, and they have to go back to the town and try to face it again, and it's terrifying. It terrified me, and if you want to be terrified, I absolutely recommend this book. And the last time I'll mention Stephen King in this video, I recommend one of his collections of short stories, and my favorite collection of short stories is Skeleton Crew. I absolutely love Stephen King as an author. I enjoy his novels, but I have to say, he is a master when it comes to short stories. He can put inside 100 pages, he grabs you, he has you connect with the characters, you know, in just a few paragraphs, the world that these characters are living in. He just, in my opinion, is brilliant at writing short stories, and these are no exception. This one, I believe the very first short story is The Mist, which they made a movie out of as well. And from that story on, you were just absolutely sucked in to each and every one of his stories. They're all either scary or disturbing or creepy, or all of the above. If you just want to dip your toe in Stephen King to see what he's about, I highly recommend any of his collections of short stories, but Skeleton Crew is a good place to start. All right, I'll give some other authors some love here. The next book on this list is The Ruins by Scott Smith. I have talked about this book before. This is one of my all-time favorite scary books. They made a movie of this one. It was garbage. So read the book. This follows a group of 20-something friends. They go on a vacation, I believe down in Mexico, having a great time. One of their friends goes missing in the jungle, and they go looking for him, and they come across this ruins. They get kind of close to it, and all of a sudden they're surrounded by local villagers, and the villagers won't let them leave. And you find out why. These group of friends is stuck on this ruins, and things start happening, bad things happen, and it's terrifying. This book terrified me, and I don't even know why I watched the movie. I guess I wanted to be even more terrified, although I wasn't, just they did a garbage job with the movie. But listen, if you're gonna go traveling, don't go off the beaten path, or else bad stuff happens. If gore is what you're looking for, this might be just the ticket for you. The next book on this list is Summer of Night by Dan Simmons. This is one of my all-time favorite coming-of-age horror stories. If you like a good coming-of-age story, if coming-of-age is would you call that a trope? Narrative? Whatever. If you like coming-of-age and you want a good scary book, this is perfect. This takes place in 1960 in a small town in Illinois, and you're following a group of 5, I believe 12-year-old boys, which is like, all 3 of those things are like my favorite. 1960s, small town, 12-year-old boys, friends, and one summer just bad stuff starts happening. It is ghost/monster story. The characters are so well written, and their friendship, you just can't help but kind of join into this group of boys and be a part of their club as they are experiencing being 12 in 1960s small town. And then bad stuff starts happening. Other little boys start going missing, and they take it upon themselves to try to figure out what's going on. And it's terrifying and just so good. I gave this one 5 stars. I want to say, I don't think it's been in any of my other videos other than, you know, if I had like a list of favorites videos, I've talked about this book. But I read this years ago, and it's remained one of my all-time favorite books. Absolutely love it. Super terrifying, totally engaging. I would recommend this book even if you weren't looking for a horror book. All right, my one and only classic on this list is Lord of the Flies by William Golding. This is, of course, a very well-known book. It's a classic. The thing that's terrifying about this book is the terrible things that young boys will do to each other when they're left alone on an island. I won't say any more. Next book on this list is Dark Places by Gillian Flynn. This is my favorite Gillian Flynn book. A lot of people prefer Gone Girl. A lot of people prefer Sharp Objects. I love Dark Places, and what a perfect title for it. It is dark, let me tell you. I don't think a lot of people would classify this as a horror, but it is very, very dark. It is very creepy. There are some disturbing scenes and some disturbing themes. So I think it meets the criteria of this list. So there you go. And it's my channel. I'll do what I want. Dark Places follows Libby. Libby has kind of been a drifter in her adult life. Not really know where she's going. And this all stems from when she was a little girl, like 7 years old. Her whole family was massacred. And her 15-year-old brother, Ben, because of evidence that Libby gave, was convicted and sent to prison. And so she has dealt with this for her whole life. But then she is contacted by kind of a group of people, kind of a cultish group of people who believe Ben is innocent. And so she goes on this path to try to discover if he is innocent. And if he is innocent, well, then who massacred her family? And she goes down this deep, dark rabbit hole of finding out secrets from other members of her family and memories that have been repressed by Libby. It's a dark, dark rabbit hole that you go on as you're reading it as well. Highly recommend. If you've read any of Gillian Flynn's other books and you enjoyed them, I imagine you've read this one too, but if you haven't, it's just a masterpiece of darkness. The next book on this list is Intensity by Dean Koontz. Hear me out, okay? I've read a lot of Dean Koontz, and this is one of my favorites. I read this book, I believe, in one sitting, and it is more than 400 pages long. This is also very, very well titled because that's how you feel. You feel everything is so intense. I could not stop turning the pages as I'm reading this book. This book follows China. She's a young woman in her 20s. She is spending, I believe, the weekend at her best friend's house. It's the family of her best friend. So it's her best friend and her parents, and there might be a sibling there. All of a sudden, the house is invaded upon by this serial killer, Edgar Vess, I want to say. I don't think Edgar's right, but just for the purposes of the video, let's just call him Edgar. He kills everybody in the house. China is able to hide like under a bed or something. She survives, but she basically watches as this guy massacres her best friend and her best friend's entire family. And then through some stroke of chance, China learns, before Edgar leaves the house, learns who his next victim is going to be. So at first, her only aim is to survive. But then when she finds out that his next victim is a little girl, she sets out to try to save her. So he's traveling via motorhome. She sneaks in and basically stows away on this motorhome with him. It goes from there, and I challenge you to put this book down once you pick it up. It is so intense, so scary. This guy is a creep in the highest order. He does some really twisted, gross things, but really the scariness of this book is just how close China comes to getting caught a bunch of times. It's so good. Please read it. And finally, for this list would not be complete without a zombie story, right? The final book on this list is The Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey. Yes, this is a zombie story, but it's so much more, and I really couldn't do it justice, so I'm going to read you the Goodreads synopsis because I think it just captures it perfectly, but leaves just enough mystery. It says, Melanie is a very special girl. Dr. Caldwell calls her our little genius. Every morning, Melanie waits in her cell to be collected for class. When they come for her, Sergeant Parks keeps his gun pointing at her while two of his people strap her into the wheelchair. She thinks they don't like her. She jokes that she won't bite, but they don't laugh. Melanie loves school. She loves learning about spelling and sums and the world outside the classroom and the children's cells. She tells her favorite teacher all the things she'll do when she grows up. Melanie doesn't know why this makes Miss Justineau look sad. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that. They made a movie on this one too, and they did actually a really good job. I really enjoyed the movie as well, but of course the book is always better, so much more detail and nuance. So while this is kind of a zombie, well, not kind of a zombie story, it's a zombie story, but not your average everyday. These are not Walking Dead zombies where they're completely brain dead. There's so much more to these zombies, and that's what makes them incredibly terrifying. And this author makes you believe that this can happen, which also makes it incredibly terrifying. So well written. You root for folks that you never thought you would root for, which is always a fun ride when you're reading a book. But I promise you, you won't be disappointed. If you want to be spooked, then this is a good one. That is it. Those are my recommendations for horror books, scary books, terrifying books, books for October specifically. Books for if you want to be disturbed. These are some of my favorites that scared the bejesus out of me, and I hope they scared the bejesus out of you. Do you have any recommendations for scary books that I should read for the month of October? Or any month that I want to be terrified? I would love to hear them. If you have any thoughts about these books, please feel free to comment down in the doodly-doo. I love to hear from you guys. If you are still watching at this point, I'd really appreciate it if you gave that like button a boop. And a subscribe would be wonderful. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.